Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 3873 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on the future of Jobcentre Plus network in Scotland. Can I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Jamie Hepburn to speak and to move the motion. Minister, 13 minutes or thereabouts, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and as invited to, I'll move the motion in my name at the outset, lest I forget later on. When we recently debated the UK Department for Work and Pensions proposals to close Jobcentre Plus facilities in Glasgow, I predict it would not be long before we debated such matters again, and here we are, Presiding Officer. The now Scotland-wide planned closures are proposals that impact on communities and people at the length and breadth of the country. They are disproportionate in impact. They have been announced with little detail, with limited consultation, with even less engagement with those who rely on and those who work in Jobcentre Plus services. Today allows this Parliament to send a loud and clear message about our concerns around the implications for those who rely on the service of their local job centre, the implications for DWP staff in locations and offices targeted for closure, and the far-reaching implication for those who rely on access to the local job centre, and particularly for vulnerable customers. On the 7th of December last year, the closure of half, 8 out of 16, job centres in Glasgow was revealed. Closure of 50% of job centres in Glasgow was revealed in the press, with no consultation or prior notice with the community affected, or with the Scottish Government, or this Scottish Parliament. As I alluded to at the outset, this Parliament had an opportunity to debate the closures in Glasgow on the 18th of January during a members' business debate brought forward by my friend Bob Doris. Voices across this chamber united with others outside this Parliament in concern about the impact on people who rely on Glasgow's job centre network. Voices united in condemnation that the proposals were not communicated to communities. Indeed, this is a UK government who seems not even to know where Glasgow is, Presiding Officer. In the House of Commons, when asked about the closures in Glasgow, Caroline Noakes MP, the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Welfare Delivery, said the Minister for Employment, that's the UK Minister for Employment, Damien Hinds, was in Musselburgh just 2 weeks ago. That in itself is just one example of how far removed the UK government is from local communities in Scotland. Presiding Officer, if these proposals were not bad enough, on the 26th of January, once again with no consultation, the DWP announced a further raft of closures across the UK and across Scotland. This lack of forewarning came despite myself having raised directly the failure to have provided such previously with Glasgow when I met Damien Hinds on the 19th of January. I wrote to him following that meeting, and I have to say, by some miraculous coincidence, with this being the day of the debate, Presiding Officer, he has replied to that letter today. What stands out at first glance in that letter is that there's not particularly much additional information. There's no commitment to consulting on all of the closures, and particularly disappointing, Presiding Officer, is the failure by Mr Hinds to commit to visit the communities and the people who will be impacted on the ground across the Scotland, to truly understand their real concerns. And I would continue to urge him to come and visit those communities. These proposals, these further proposals that were revealed on the 26th of January, it was an officer will impact on a further 16 sites in other parts of Scotland. 9 job centres, 6 back offices and 1 centre for health and disability assessment. Let me be clear, it could mean the closure of a further 6 job centres: Broxburn, Edinburgh City, Inverness, Port Glasgow, Alexandria and Benbecula. We've also learned from the press that Grangemouth Job Centre, which isn't even listed on the planned closure list, is planned to move to Falkirk. That we continue to be finding out details through the media rather than directly from the UK government is a continuing demonstration of the failure to properly communicate these decisions. And we know in Greenock 28 staff and services will move from the current job centre across Greenock before March 2018. That is a move that involves a distance of 2.9 miles. Had this been judged to be 0.1 of a mile more, a consultation on closure would have been required. It is my view that any proposal for closure should be open to consultation. The UK government can't just make decisions based on lines or circles on a map, which it seems very clear has formed much of how the decisions about sites to be closed has been made. President, I want to highlight my concerns about these plans, concerns echoed by the First Minister in this chamber last week, and concerns I've heard directly from people who will be affected. The factor that seems to have driven these changes seems to be largely predicated on lease arrangements for buildings job centres are located in coming to an end. That strikes me as an odd way to determine which communities should have the continued provision of job centre services. It also seems clear that having to travel further, as many job centre service users will have to do, will have the biggest impact on those who are vulnerable, with health and mobility problems, or those with caring commitments. Decisions based on lines drawn on maps, Presiding Officer, do not reflect the reality that many people do not own or have access to a car. Decisions based on lines drawn on maps do not reflect the reality of how communities are connected with one another by public transport. Decisions based on lines drawn on maps do not reflect the reality that increased travel costs will be a strain for families already under financial pressure. This chamber, all of us should make no mistake, these closures have left people worried. At the invitation of Bob Doris and Patrick Grady, MP, I visited Maryhill Borough Halls earlier this week, and I heard worries from some service users about the cost of travel, worries about hard choices between paying for travel or paying for food. The additional challenge of accessing more remote job centres at appointed times will also, it seems inevitable to me, increase the risk of being subject to benefits sanctions. This was a particular concern I heard in Maryhill and when I visited Parkhead Housing Association last week. These changes also threaten important established relationships with work coaches. I know firsthand how dedicated and how hard-working many DWP staff are. For all our concerns and criticisms of the framework at which they have to work to, I know that DWP staff are committed to those they work with. But I know productive relationships with DWP work coaches are also really important to customers with complex or sensitive needs who get to know and trust the work coach they work with. When I met One Parents Family Scotland alongside Citizens Advice Bureau and Home Start in Maryhill this week, they spoke eloquently of the dehumanising effect on claimants having often to share personal stories with strangers and over again. These closures are also not rationalising the assumption the DWP proposals assume are rationalised on the assumption that DWP proposals assume more people now access Jobcentre Plus services online. But a significant number of clients either do not have the IT facilities they need to access these services, or in fact rely on their local job centres for the facilities to undertake computer search and apply for jobs online. In many cases, the closure of a local job centre will make accessing services online more difficult. Presiding Officer, the reality is DWP plans mean not just the closure of job centres across Scotland, but the closure of back office facilities as well. The DWP also proposed closure of 6 administrative centres across Scotland. These are not simply faceless back-of-house administrative offices. These facilities employ hard-working, dedicated and committed people who work to ensure frontline services can be effective. These facilities provide significant numbers of jobs and make a vital contribution to local areas. DWP ministers have stated that staff impacted by these changes will have the option of moving elsewhere. But that may not be possible in every instance. For example, jobs in Sylvan House in Edinburgh could be moved or redeployed to Newcastle by March 2018. Staff in Cumnock will find it difficult to be able to readily travel to elsewhere to continue employment with DWP. I have met with the Public and Commercial Services Union and shared their concerns about the negative impact these closures will have on job centre staff as well as service users. I believe, Presiding Officer, we should explore all of the options to ensure services are still there for those who need them. Joint working between this Scottish Government and the UK Government could better realise that. Our new devolved employment support services should trigger the opportunity to align existing employability support at a Scottish level and at a UK level here in Scotland, and to drive alignment and shared governance and accountability. Paragraph 58 of the Smith Commission agreement said the UK and Scottish Government will identify ways to further link services through methods such as co-location, wherever possible, and establish more formal mechanisms to govern the Jobcentre Plus network in Scotland. I'll, of course, give way to Mr Tompkins, who will understand very well, given he was part of the Commission.
Adam Tompkins.
I'm not solely responsible for having written every word of the Smith Commission agreement, Minister, but thank you for the compliment. There's very much within the Minister's remarks that I agree with. But could I push him a little on whether he has made any particular suggestions, either through the Joint Ministerial Working Group on Welfare or through any other mechanism of intergovernmental communication, about the location of any specific devolved service in any of the job centres or other DWP properties which are cited for closure?
Minister.
Well, let me be clear. I don't know that accepting the intervention was so much meant to be a compliment to Mr Tompkins. And I certainly am aware he didn't write the entirety of the Smith Commission process. I hope that wasn't him trying to step back from a shared commitment to paragraph 58 of the Smith Commission agreement. I hear him saying from a sedentary position, absolutely not. I very much welcome that. In terms of his point, and I recognise that this has been laid out in the terms of the amendment that Mr Tompkins has presented, much of which I could have accepted, but I think it's unfortunate he has altered or sought to alter the wording, and this is why we will not be accepting his amendment. He sought to alter the wording that these changes will. I think it's clear these changes that proposed by the DLP will have a negative impact on service users. He would rather say they may have a negative impact on service users. Much of the rest of the tenor of his amendment I actually agree with. For example, he referred to the need in his amendment to have the process of two-way dialogue, and I absolutely accept the need for two-way dialogue. All I can say to this chamber is that right now it's rather been much, as from my perspective, an effort at one-way dialogue from our side and little by the way of any dialogue coming back. And with respect to the specific point that Mr Tompkins has made, I have sought to explore the possibility of how we can undertake a programme of co-location with the UK Government. My officials have done so. Skills Development Scotland have met with the DWP to try and see how we can undertake that at specific locations. But what I can say to this chamber, and I would have thought this would be a self-evident point, Presiding Officer, it's rather difficult to come to any specific proposal about any specific location where a job centre might be closed when we don't find out about the specific centres that are going to be closed until a decision seems to have been taken. So if we want to engage in meaningful dialogue around the terms of paragraph 58, I think it would rather be better if the DWP engaged in that process of two-way dialogue that Mr Smith has urged, and that I'm sure this entire Parliament would accept as necessary, so we can see how we can co-locate services to ensure better services for people on the ground. Let me be very clear, the process so far around this closure agreement suggests further progress is needed to make the terms of paragraph 58 of the Smith Commission agreement a reality. Let me conclude, Presiding Officer. The rationale for the decisions taken by the UK Government need to be better explained, examined and justified. The Scottish Government, and I believe this Parliament, should be involved in planning and delivery of co-location or outreach services, a point I just made hopefully very clearly to Mr Tompkins. More can and must be done to seek alternative accommodation or facilities in locations where job centres could close. So I would therefore urge the UK Government to share its plans to allow this Scottish Government to better engage and provide a platform for further discussion in paragraph 58 of the Smith Commission. And until they do so, Presiding Officer, I believe it's incumbent, and I hope this entire Parliament will unite this evening to send a very clear message to the UK Government. Until they engage in that process, they should halt their specific process of their closures to allow for us to collectively ensure continued support for our communities. And I urge this Parliament to back that position.
Thank you, Minister. I call on Adam Tompkins to speak to and move Amendment 3873.1.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. From the day I discovered that the DWP had plans to close a number of job centres, initially in Glasgow and then across Scotland more broadly, I articulated my concerns about the proposals, first to the Secretary of State, as the Minister knows, and latterly in this Parliament and indeed in the press. And from the beginning, our priority has been to seek to understand the proposals, not to condemn them, but neither to condone them. Our amendment to today's motion seeks to reflect that position. First, Presiding Officer, I think it's important to understand the context in which this is happening. And there are two elements to this. The first is that there is, in Westminster, all-party agreement, including the Labour Party and the SNP, that the future of Jobcentre Plus needs to be different from its past. The nature of the employment market is changing, and the nature of the work that job centres perform is also changing. For example, it's increasingly important to the work of job centres for them to have the facility and the space to act as recruiting hubs for local employers, so that employers can seek to hire employees at those job centres. And this is much easier to do with a smaller number of larger job centres than it is with a larger number of smaller job centres. And it's worth recalling that in November, the all-party House of Commons Work and Pensions Committee unanimously said, and I quote, that the future of Jobcentre Plus is one of change. To make a success of its new expanded role, JCP Jobcentre Plus will have to ensure that it is open to working in ways that are increasingly flexible, adaptable and experimental.
Polly McNeill.
Thank the member for giving way, and you rightly talk about a UK perspective on job centre closures. But do you think that Glasgow, the city you represent, is ready for half of its centres to close, particularly given the level of digital exclusion that there is in Glasgow?
Adam Tompkins.
I've said before that I think that all 8 of the Glasgow job centres that are cited for closure should be put to public consultation. I've made that point to the Secretary of State. I've made that point in this chamber before. 3 of them have been put to public consultation, and my view is that all 8 of them should have been. The second part of the context in which I think we have to understand this set of proposals is that the DWP's proposals are coming at a time when the jobs market in the UK, including here in Scotland, has changed very considerably. There are now more jobs in the British economy than ever before, with more than 2.7 million more jobs than there were when Labour were last in office in 2010. In Glasgow, and Pauline McNeill just asked me about Glasgow, in Glasgow the claimant count has fallen by 44% since 2010. And in this context, it is surely rational to keep under review the nature and scale of the job centre provision that we need. Happy to give away again.
Bob Doris. Microphone, Mr Doris, your microphone.
Yeah. Whilst we have some issues with the statistics that Mr Tompkins uses in terms of the claimant count falling, would you accept that those who remain unemployed in Glasgow will be some of the most marginalised, vulnerable and furthest away from the labour market that you will find anywhere in the UK? And it is those very individuals and families that need that service at the heart of their communities, not 3.5 miles away.
Adam Tompkins.
I accepted that point when we debated the issue on Mr Doris's motion on the 19th of January, and I accept it again. The very next sentence of my remarks here says that all of this said, as I said in our earlier debate on this matter a few weeks ago, even if the nature of the demand is changing, and even if the nature of the work that job centres perform is changing, it remains an important consideration that that demand is met locally where possible. And we know that there are some of our fellow citizens who are a long way removed from the jobs market. And we know that it's already enough of a challenge to encourage such people to engage with their work coaches at their local job centres. And to move job centres further away from where these people live may act as a further disincentive to engage, making these people even harder to reach. That cannot be in their interests, and neither is it in the national interest, which is why I have called in the past for all 8 of the Glasgow Job Centre closure proposals to be put to public consultation so that we can better understand what is at stake. But I would say this, Presiding Officer, if this applies to Job Centre Plus, surely it also applies to other public services. And since we last spoke about job centres in this Parliament, in the debate that was brought forward by Mr Doris, I've received notification that no fewer than 4 police stations across Glasgow are being reviewed, as Police Scotland put it. This is what I've been told. Police Scotland is currently assessing its estate requirements. So again, a proposal which is driven by estate requirements, with many of its buildings no longer meeting current operational requirements. This means that we need to consider the viability and suitability of some of our... I've already given way twice. The viability and suitability of some of our properties.
Point of order, Ms White.
This debate is titled Job Centre Closures. Can I ask you to rule that talking about police stations has absolutely nothing whatsoever with job centres?
Thank you, Ms White. I've already considered, not really a point of order, but I've already considered whether it was far from the mark of the amendment, and as it was going on to other closures as an example of centralising my understanding and then moving back to job centres, it was just within a whisker of being within your amendment.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, as I understand it, within Glasgow, Pollockshaw's police station may close. So might Saracen Police Station, which I think is in Bob Doris's constituency. So to Easterhouse, so to Castlemilk. So where are the howls of anguish from the SNP's Glasgow MSPs when it comes to the proposed closure of police officers? Surely what goes for the DWP goes also for police officers. But I've already given, Mr Mason, I'm not going to give way to you on this occasion, no. It is important, I think, also, Presiding Officer, to understand what is not happening with regard to job centres. The DWP's proposals are about enhancing services, not cutting them. It's not about, it is about improving claimant access to more employers. The proposals are for a reduction in floor space only. All staff and services will be relocated and no job losses are planned. Indeed, the number of work coaches in Scotland is going up. 122 work coaches were hired by the DWP in Scotland between April and September of last year, notwithstanding the fact that there are fewer claimants than there have at any point since the 1970s. Give way to the Minister.
Minister.
I'm just picking up on the point that there are no planned job losses, and I accept and readily concede that I'm at an advantage, although I haven't seen it that much before, Mr Tompkins. In the letter I have received from Damien Hines today, it says very clearly, one of the few things it is rather clear on is at this stage it is not possible to say how many potential redundancies may be necessary.
Mr Tompkins.
The Minister has been assiduous in sharing correspondence with Glasgow MSPs and with members of the Social Security Committee that he's received from UK Government ministers until today, but that letter wasn't shared with us before today. Last month, Presiding Officer, I visited Partick Jobcentre, which is one of the larger job centres in Glasgow, and I asked staff and managers there about the DWP's plans. And one of the things that's happening in that part of Glasgow is that Anniesland Job Centre is to be closed, with its work being rolled mainly into Partick, but partly also into Drumchapel. And the staff and managers at Partick assured me that their job centre has ample capacity to absorb the additional work from Anniesland. They also told me that Anniesland is working at only 1/3 capacity. And I asked how they knew that, because I know that questions have been raised. I know that questions have been raised in the House of Commons about how job centre capacity is measured. And they told me this: well, Anniesland Job Centre is located in a 3-storey building, and 2 stories of it are closed. Only 1/3 of the building that the taxpayer is renting is being used by the job centre. The other 2/3 are being leased. I'm in my last 2 seconds. Are being used by other government departments. So this illustrates the magnitude of what we are talking about. We're talking about redesigning job centres to be more effective rather than cutting services. And if we held that in our minds, perhaps we would understand the proposals a bit more clearly. Finally, as regards co-location and linking devolved employability services and the like with Job Centre Plus, I am all in favour of this, as the Minister knows. Indeed, I want there to be more joined-up working between the UK Government and the Scottish Government, not less. And I fully accept what he said about two-way streets in terms of communication and dialogue rather than monologue on this score. But as our amendment makes clear, this is a two-way process, and the Minister, for all his protestations to the contrary, I think, has been remarkably reticent, if I may say so, to come forward with concrete proposals as to how either Skills Development Scotland or the proposed new Scottish Social Security Agency could, in practice, co-locate or link with existing job centre provision. So rather than shouting from the rooftops, perhaps a little more maturity might have realised better results. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Mr Tompkins. I now call on Mark Griffin to open for Labour. 7 minutes, please, Mr Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The closure of 23 job centres the DWP is pursuing will affect deprived communities right across Scotland, from Lanarkshire and Glasgow to the Western Isles and the Highlands. Labour benches will support the Government motion today because we agree these closures must be halted and because both governments must find a way forward. Since December, Glasgow Labour has worked hand in hand with their SNP counterparts to fight the proposals. Their 8 job centres, half the number in this city, are up for closure. They've been working together for the sake of people who are desperately looking to exercise their right to work and need the support of their job centre to do that. Now that the same challenge extends across the country, I hope that's something all parties and party leaders will join the call today for the DWP to halt these closures. Ruth Davidson must break her silence on the closure of the job centre in her own Edinburgh constituency, the massive impact job closures will have on the Glasgow region she vacated and wider Scotland. At a time when the Tories are cutting social security and hitting low-pay workers with sanctions, when 139,000 people in Scotland are out of work, these proposals are reckless at best and at worst, utterly perverse. It's completely counterproductive for the UK government to close so many job centres. And the Tory spin used to justify the Glasgow cuts is shocking and masks the true harm these closures will inflict on Scotland's communities. Well, the Tories point out, as they did last month and today, the claimant count in the city is down 44%, but they choose to overlook that the count across Scotland remains 14% higher than it was before the financial crash. In fact, the number of people economically inactive who would still like a job still stands at 190,000, 5% higher than before the crash. But the claimant count doesn't give the whole picture, of course. As PCS point out, the effect of welfare reform is that too many people are falling between the cracks. Digitalisation, sanctions and mandatory reconsideration means fewer people are claiming entitlements they deserve. It's astonishing, Presiding Officer, that £2 billion in social security payments go unclaimed in Scotland each year, with JSA and ESA making up almost 600 million. And when you take into account the difficulty people face in just trying to make a claim, unless these closures are halted, that number will just keep increasing. One-parent families Scotland and Inclusion Scotland stress the fears lone parents and disabled people face due to these closures. Increased travel times which risk lateness and the threat of sanctions. Unaffordable £4.50 bus tickets or taxis for longer journeys. Childcare arrangements and all that added to the stress of meeting DWP demands to avoid sanctions. PCS highlight the value of local labour market knowledge set to be lost at the Easterhouse Jobcentre. In an area so deprived, staff knowledge of local employers means that real employment support is provided, helping people find local, accessible work rather than several bus journeys away. And it's a right... Certainly.
Adam Tompkins.
Grateful to the member for giving way. There are 713 job centres across Great Britain. Can I just make sure that I've understood the Labour Party position to be that there are no circumstances at all in which any of these 713 job centres could ever be closed or merged?
Mark Griffin.
I think if the Conservative government were to invest in public services and get those people out of work and we had a zero unemployment rate, then maybe there'd be a case to close job centres. But when the claimant count, when the unemployed rate is still higher now than it was before the crash, I don't think there is a justification for making those closures. And I think it's ironic that these closures will have a wider impact on their local communities and job markets. Those are anchor offices in communities. When they're pulled, so too is the passing trade, the service jobs that keep people fed at lunchtime, bus networks running and offices cleaned. Not just the people who rely on the support from those job centres, there will be wider job losses as well. And at the same time, critical support networks from organisations like CAB will be abandoned. The Tories have said that no jobs will be lost in Scotland. We've heard different news from the Minister in response to a letter to the Scottish Government. But I've already been contacted by constituents, non-mobile staff, who have contacted me to say that they've had belated consultation and one-to-one interviews to discuss their own position as a result of the proposals before April. And I think in a shocking display of honesty, Annie Wells is on record saying that she can neither condemn or condone these closures. I think that's a sentiment articulated again by Mr Tompkins again today. Ruth Davidson remains in hiding on this issue, even though it affects her own constituency. And given that communities across Scotland will be affected by these closures, that is simply not good enough. Ruth Davidson's Tories need to stop trying to rebuild the economy off the backs of the poor, the sick and disabled people, and call on the DWP to halt these plans. The motion recalls the Smith Commission agreement that more should be done to devolve formal governance over the network and to explore the options for co-location. The triggering of that dialogue should have happened well before the closure of the Glasgow offices were announced. The UK Government must halt these closure plans and work with the Scottish Government to deliver this. With new powers over employability coming to this Parliament, ministers must now explore those co-location opportunities. We on these benches expect to see services free of the punitive sanctions regimes and the misery they create. But we also expect services which provide high quality, responsive, local employment support to get people into work that they want, cutting through the worst effects of Tory austerity to help tackle poverty here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, delivering the dignity and respect in these schemes doesn't rely solely on these job centres, but finding ways to protect them, to halt these closures, would certainly help contribute to that ambition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Griffin. We now move to the open debate. I call Bob Torres to be followed by Annie Wells. Mr Doris, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, on Monday I met with single parents who will be impacted by the job centre closure in Maryhill, along with Patrick Grady MP, and I thank the Minister Jamie Hepburn MSP for listening to those very real concerns on his visit to Maryhill Borough Halls to find out their fears. And the concerns were very real, concerns such as how on earth do they get to Springburn, a 4-bus round trip, and for some potentially a 2.5-hour journey, and that's with caring commitments as well. Concerns over the cost of public transport to get there. A £4.50 day ticket is a huge chunk out of a benefit of around £70 or so a week. Concern over losing the relationship claimants have developed with their Jobcentre Plus job coach, which is not guaranteed under the proposed changes, no matter what Jobcentre Plus have told us. They've told us that staff have the option of transferring to a job centre closer to where they stay if they wish, so they're just wrong on that front. But not just concerns, but actually fear over the risk of sanctions should their family and their caring commitments be inconsistent with changed appointment times and longer journey times, and sleepless nights over the impact that this will have on their children, not on them, but on their children and families. That's their primary concern. But despite all this today, the Tories have unfortunately sought to water down the position of this Parliament in opposing such closures. The Tories can't even bring themselves to talk about the impact closure will have. That changes to may have in the motion. That, Presiding Officer, is a sad and pathetic lip service to those who will, not may, be impacted. The worry caused by the proposed closures is already having a very real impact. I met the people on Monday that it's already impacting. I actually believe that the Tories wish to do more than just pay lip service. However, it's increasingly clear that the Tory line on Jobcentre Plus is not one developed in Scotland, but rather by a UK Tory government. And can I say to the Tories, it's time to stand up for your constituents, not the Conservatives. Now, can I say a little bit about equality impact assessments, or rather the lack of them? Now, you need some basic information before you can even conduct an equality impact assessment, such as maybe the catchment area that the Jobcentre Plus actually covers, non-existent. Maybe you need to know the amount of claimants that use the job centre. They're a bit hazy about that as well. In fact, they're worse than hazy about that. I was told with Patrick Grady MP in a visit to Jobcentre Plus in Maryhill, they don't collect that kind of information. That's right, they don't actually collect that kind of information. Just ridiculous. Now, if anyone wants to know why there should be an equality impact assessment, can I ask you to look at the Inclusion Scotland briefing prepared for today's debate and for my members' debate the other week. I won't reiterate that here, but it is vital that no decision is made until a full, genuine equality impact assessment is conducted across all Jobcentre Plus sites. But can also pick out the Inclusion Scotland briefing for another reason. I wanted to give the case study that they gave, which I think is very pertinent to my local job centre. I'm sure many others that constituency MSPs have across this chamber. The case study, one client told Jobcentre Plus that he did not have the money to get there for an appointment. They advised him to walk, but he explained that his poor health meant that he was unable to walk the long distance. He received a 13-week sanction for failing to attend. So not my words, but the words of someone who's living the life of a benefits claimant who has to survive. Think of the physical and mental health impact that many of the vulnerable claimants are facing right now. Presiding Officer, I want to try and be optimistic somewhere within this debate, because out of crisis you can actually get opportunity. And I actually found, and I didn't actually realise it, that the relationship between the job coaches, the work coaches and many of the claimants is a very positive one. Not always, but for many it's a very positive one. I've already said that link is not guaranteed. I heard that those service users, those claimants, sometimes had that good relationship, but so did One Parent Family Scotland, Citizens Advice Scotland and Home Start. Positive intermediaries in trying to support the vulnerable individual who should be at the heart of all of this, but it was positive local relationships. Maryhill Jobcentre have clients dropping in, for example, outside required times using its IT facilities for job searches and support provided. Those people won't go to Springburn. There are no other appropriate facilities with support in the local area, and it's just not on. And I want to say a little bit about co-location. Now, Mr Tompkins tried to compare the co-location options of Jobcentre Plus and Scottish public agencies with police estate rationalisation. I got the same email as Mr Tompkins got from Commander Ross Allen at Maryhill Police Station. What he told me on the 24th of the 1st was efforts are underway to identify suitable front counter facilities in a shared facility in the local community to complement the other existing subdivision police offices at Maryhill and Bear Street. In other words, what Police Scotland are doing in our communities, Mr Tompkins, is they're talking to the MSPs and they're saying, we are not leaving the communities, let's identify co-location options. What Jobcentre Plus is saying is we're out of here. Good luck with your benefits claimants. It's very, very different, and don't mislead this Parliament. And what Police Scotland are doing is unbecoming of an MSP trying to defend vulnerable people in Glasgow. Now, let me talk about co-location a little bit more, if I have time.
No, you're not. You're in your last minute.
Maryhill as a community is ripe for co-location. I was listening through some of the organisations: Citizens Advice Scotland, Avenue Park Street, Home Start just down the road, One Parent Family Scotland, Jobs and Business Glasgow, Coop Housing, GHA, Maryhill Housing, 2 nearby Skills Development Scotland shops. And as Maryhill Jobcentre celebrates its 75th anniversary as well, we could do something really special in relation to co-location and meet the needs of these vulnerable constituents that I represent, the vulnerable constituents right across Scotland that we all represent, but not like this. Give these great ideas breathing space to develop and to exist. We have to halt all these closures and we have to think again.
Thank you, Mr Doris. I call Annie Wells to be followed by Claire Hockey. Ms Wells, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I understand the concerns that have been raised here today and at the members' debate on the 19th of January, in which I spoke. During that debate, I was open about my concerns over how the proposals were communicated and the speed with which the consultation took place. I was open about the concern I had for the consultation being restricted to just the 3 centres, as Adam Tompkins has said, Bridgeton, Maryhill and Castlemilk, as well as making clear that services need to be made accessible as possible for everyone. And I reiterated these concerns in my response to the DWP's public consultation. And whilst I stated it was right to review the future of job centres in light of the 20-year lease contract coming to an end next year, and statistics revealing a 20 to 40% under-occupancy rate, I didn't believe it was right to steamroll ahead with blanket closures without fully considering the responses submitted. At the very least, in the event of any closures, I stated we could not find ourselves in a situation where those with disabilities, long-term illnesses or severe lack of funds were found to be disadvantaged by increased journey times. If closures did take place, systematic provisions with a clearly defined system would need to be made and communicated in a way that was clear to all. This could be through a programme of tailored outreach, home visits, online applications, or for those not able to access, applying by post. And I echo the concerns of other members regarding the need for DWP to provide more detail on the issue. Particularly now that consultation is closed, I am pleased to see this request has been retained in my colleague's amendment. For me, communication is key, and at the moment we are not having meaningful dialogue about alternatives that may need to be put in place. Not at the moment, I'll just want to make some progress. Alternatives which could provide as good a service as we are seeing just now. There were ideas put forward within the consultation template itself, in fact, that could go a long way in solving this issue and reaching a compromise that disadvantages no one. An alternative service, for example, that saw members of Jobcentre Plus staff travelling to community venues to carry out their work. So why not consider this? Yeah?
Sandra White.
I thank the member for taking an intervention on that one point. When we were doing an investigation, we went to Musselburgh and Jobcentre. They have outreach there. And one of the issues that was raised was when someone turned up at the library there, which was outreach, they had a sick line and they thought they could hand it to the person from the Jobcentre Plus. And they were told no, they had to go to the Jobcentre Plus and hand it in there. So how do we get over that? Surely that's something that's very, very wrong.
Annie Wells.
Well, that's where we do need to have relative dialogue, and it's a two-way process. So we need to make sure that we are not looking at problems, but we're looking at solutions. And that's what I am trying to put forward here. In its response to the consultation, Poverty Alliance even stated that despite wishing for centres to remain open, this might be an alternative option. The obvious concerns were ensuring that service users had access to an environment in which they felt safe and that they could speak privately without their concerns being overheard. It also stated that one advisor alone would not be sufficient to meet the needs of the community. However, there is no reason why these concerns could not be properly addressed in the provision of a full outreach service, protecting the most vulnerable and those with childcare responsibilities. Sorry, I just want to move on. Even now, it already occurs that in some circumstances where people feel sufficiently vulnerable, that members of the Jobcentre Plus network visit their homes, and could we not expand on this also? In a debate on the 30th of January, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Welfare Delivery, Caroline Noakes, was open to suggestions of using satellite visits, using commercial premises so that job organisations can run them and workplace coaches can coach a number of people together. And if we're actually looking at making the services better, there are more creative ways of working, and I would point to substantial powers the Scottish Government now has over employment services. I appreciate the Minister.
Ms Wells makes a number of innovative and very sensible suggestions about how we could better provide Jobcentre Plus services in the community. She and Mr Tompkins have referred to the process of two-way dialogue. I know that Mr Tompkins was at pains to point out that both he and Ms Wells had communicated their concerns to the UK Government. I'm just wondering what response Ms Wells has had yet to her innovative suggestions from the UK Government.
Ms Wells.
As I was saying, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary said that they'd be opened to these during the debate on the 30th of January. Pardon?
Don't have your discussion across the chamber, if you don't mind.
And I appreciate that the Employability Minister has opened the floor for discussions between Skills Development Scotland and the DWP, but we also need more information on how that's going to work as well. But today I'd like to make a few final points by closing. There has been no mention of the DWP of it making cuts to investment. And again, as I said in my last speech, over 122 additional work coaches were recruited to Jobcentre Plus in Scotland last year to ease workload and provide a service based more on rapport. I'd also like to ask members to reflect on something my colleague Adam Tompkins has already mentioned. I recognise that police offices and job centres are two very different services. However, both these services are used by people who are vulnerable, and no one can deny that. So, I'm running out of time. So, I recognise the UK Government needs to provide more information on the timing and scope of these closures, and I am pleased that we've retained this in our amendment alongside the need for equality impact assessments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Claire Hockey to be followed by Jackie Bailey. Ms Hockey, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Some would call the closure of the job centres decimation, but it's worse than that. Decimation means culling 1 in 10. In Glasgow, we will experience a cull of 1 in 2 job centres in the next year. The reduction in the number of job centres will mean many people will, for a host of reasons, need to take transport to alternative centres. And I want to quote a job seeker's feedback to One Parent Family Scotland here, and she said, the cost is going to be a big issue, £4.50 for an all-day ticket. From an income of £73.10 a week, it's a lot, like losing food shopping for a day. I'm sure policymakers don't see the problem in needing to spend £4.50 on transport once a week, but for the people affected in some of the poorest parts of the UK, they will definitely suffer because of this. 1 in 3 children in Glasgow are living in poverty. These are communities with real issues, where child poverty is high,
and where £4.50 for an all-day bus ticket is just too much money to spend on transport rather than eating. Looking at an example in my own constituency of Rutherglen in the area of Newton Farm, the current walk from to Cambuslang Job Centre takes 37 minutes, and that's one way. As Cambuslang Job Centre is now due to close, the walk to the next job centre in Rutherglen is 1 hour and 19 minutes. This walk, assuming you're fit and healthy, means that what was once an hour and a quarter round trip will now take 2.5 hours. I haven't tried this walk, presiding officer. I've just been using the Westminster Government's tool of choice, Google Maps, to check this result. And it's strange, as this is the tool that they consulted to make sure that no trip to a job centre would take that long. Simply assuming that people can pay the bus or a taxi fare or can just walk to the next job centre shows how removed from reality the policymakers in Westminster are. The lack of consultation or impact assessment on many of these closures shows willful ignorance on just how these closures will impact on the lives of ordinary people. These are policies that don't take into account people's responsibilities as caregivers, of their own ill health, or of any individual circumstances whatsoever. They're focused on purely cutting numbers, cutting services, and cutting investment in people, particularly in the people of Glasgow. Certainly.
Adam Tompkins.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Could the member identify even a single service that is being cut in Glasgow? I understand that premises are being closed, but could the member identify even a single job centre service that is being cut? Because that's what she just said.
Claire Hawkey.
Mr Tompkins, I believe this is just the thin end of the wedge. Presiding officer, we need a social security system that works for Scotland, not for the establishment at Westminster. We need to invest in people and treat them with dignity and understand that the overwhelming majority of people want to be working. This continual turning of the screw of sanctions, of daily signing on, and now the slashing of job centres is simply Westminster setting up more and more hoops for people to jump through. As was laid out in the Scottish Government's employability support consultation, Scotland needs a system that takes into account everyone's individual circumstances. Avoiding sanctions shouldn't be the biggest concern for a job seeker. Neither should be the worries about how they will manage a 2.5-hour round trip to sign on. Personal action plans should take into account consideration for their circumstances, whether they're a parent or a caregiver, whether they have physical or mental health issues. And the aim shouldn't merely be to get someone into a job, any job, just to get them off the books and keep the numbers down. Job centre provision should help people to build careers, to help them get real jobs that will see real economic and personal development, not put them back on the 0 hours merry-go-round that will see them back at the job centre and receiving treatment for stress. The DWP should be looking to support people to build sustainable careers and to build communities that don't have some of the highest child poverty rates in Scotland, thanks in part to the sanctions laid at mothers already on the breadline. Job centres are already down in Scotland from 117 in 2008 to 104 today, and now we're going to see a further cut of 23 sites. Presiding officer, they are closing these centres without consultation in the communities affected. There has been no consultation over the closure of Cambuslang Job Centre, despite some areas it serves being a minimum of 80 minutes walk away from Rutherglen Job Centre. And this runs counter to the DWP's own consultation criteria of being within reasonable travel distances. If they won't consult the community, then they need to consult the Scottish Government on the best way to structure the job centre network in a way that supports the most vulnerable. So I call on the UK Government at Westminster to halt these closures and to work with the Scottish Government. As was agreed in the Smith Commission, the UK Government is supposed to be committed to working with the Scottish Government to create, and I quote, more formal mechanisms to govern the Job Centre Plus sites in Scotland. Presiding officer, now is the time for Westminster to honour the Smith Commission, as we desperately need to find a solution that suits the many unique conditions here in Scotland and especially in Glasgow.
Thank you. I call Jackie Bailey to be followed by George Adams. Bailey, please.
Presiding officer, the latest wave of closures includes the Alexandria Job Centre in my constituency. I first heard about the proposal 2 weeks ago when I received an email at 1 p.m. inviting me to meet Damien Hines, the Minister for Employment, at 4 p.m. on the same day in London. Clearly, geography is not the Minister's strong point. But he also said that staff and service users in Alexandria would be moved to the job centre in Dumbarton. Not to worry, I was told, because the two sites are just 3 miles apart. But I've checked the actual distance, and it's 3.5 miles apart. Now, that isn't nitpicking. It's important because the DWP has only agreed to launch full public consultation on job centre closures where the distance between the two sites is over 3 miles. So I want a consultation for the closure of Alexandria. Now, either the DWP has simply not bothered to work out how far they're forcing staff and claimants to travel, or they do know the actual distance but want to avoid proper scrutiny of their plans. Like the round of closures in Glasgow announced at the end of last year, the Department for Work and Pensions' handling of the Alexandria closure has been wholly unsatisfactory. There was no consultation with job centre staff before the announcement. There was no information provided on the number of claimants affected by the closure. There was no equality impact assessment to examine the impact on some of the most marginalised groups in my constituency. And let's be honest about the reasons behind these closures. Decisions on which job centres to close and the timing of the announcements has been determined by the fact that the leases of the buildings are coming to an end. This is about properties and saving money. The last thing it is about are the needs of job seekers and local communities. I would be interested to know whether their reluctance to engage properly with the people who will be affected by the closures is down to the fact that they are in a rush to hand in their notice to the landlords. The local PCS make the point that at the time when the DWP is requiring benefits to engage more frequently in face-to-face interviews in job centres, they should be opening more, not closing the ones we have. To close the Alexandria Job Centre would without a doubt make it even harder for people in the Vale of Leven to find work. It makes a complete mockery of Theresa May's pledge at Tory conference to lead a government which cares about ordinary working people. This closure will hit, very briefly,
Bob Doris.
Forgiven way. Can I just say, as someone who's had to sign on at Alexandria Job Centre in years gone by, that journey to Dumbarton would be not practical but unrealistic, and it would be devastating to do regeneration attempts in Alexandria Town Centre.
Jackie Bailey.
I couldn't agree more, because the closure will hit some of the poorest families in the Vale of Leven with extra travel costs and fewer opportunities to find a job. Across the country, we are facing a jobless crisis. There are 39,000 Scots out of work. Numbers of people who are economically inactive has risen, many of whom want to find work. But if you look at the caseload statistics produced by the DWP for May 2016, you will see that the communities served by this job centre, Alexandria, Renton, Tullochune, have populations with approximately 60% more people than the Scottish average in receipt of the 5 key benefits. This is clearly an area with high levels of service demand. It makes no sense to close this job centre. Scotland's economy is lagging behind the rest of the United Kingdom. There is less employment and there is more unemployment. So whether you consider my local argument or indeed a national one, shutting down Alexandria and vast swathes of the job centre network is completely wrong-headed. So where is the condemnation from Ruth Davidson? I think I can safely say that she's not shy by nature. I don't know whether she's actually representing the Tory party at Westminster or the people in Scotland, because these closures will affect her constituents too. She owes it to them, at least, to demand a halt. Tory ministers used to tell unemployed people to get on their bike to find a job. In Alexandria, they might not have a choice because the public transport links to Dumbarton are so unreliable. The Transport Minister will be aware of frequent station skipping on ScotRail services in my area. The buses are not much better either, with services often cancelled without notice. Once the DWP has finally worked out the actual distance between Dumbarton and Alexandria, I would urge them to actually try making the journey themselves. I invite the Minister to come up and do so, because it is one thing looking at Google Maps and another to stand waiting for a bus or train which never turns up. This will have very real consequences for unemployed and disabled people in Alexandria who miss appointments or arrive late through no fault of their own. Sanctions will increase and local families will suffer. And what about the cost of travel? If you're on a fixed low income, you may sometimes not have the funds to pay for travel. The DWP will apparently pay for travel, but only for attendance above the fortnightly signing appointment. A train ticket for a return journey from Alexandria to Dumbarton is £3.60. On a low income, that's a lot of money. Finally, Presiding Officer, the DWP talk about co-location with council services. Well, in Alexandria, there is an effective partnership between the council's Working for You service and the Job Centre. They weren't consulted in advance of this announcement. What we will miss is the opportunity for joined-up employability services, a gateway to learning and money advice, and actually getting people into jobs. The closure of the Job Centre will undermine all of this. Presiding Officer, Alexandria is simply not an add-on to Dumbarton. It's a community in its own right. There's a clear need for a job centre, and I ask the UK Government to think again.
Thank you. I call George Adam, followed by Gordon Lyndhurst. Mr Adam, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm glad to take part in this debate because for me it is very, very personal. Because I feel that my town, my place of birth, is under attack from an uncaring right-wing Tory government. This UK government in Westminster believes that Paisley does not need the 300 jobs that come with the loan-end DWP office. No thinking about the economic future of our town when this heartless Westminster government decides it's time to get rid of this valuable facility. 300 jobs, Presiding Officer, 300 jobs at a DWP office that is part of the back-of-house support mechanism for many of our citizens at a time when they really need that support. There are a number of parts of this decision that does not make sense. One of the first is the secretive way that this closure was announced. On the morning of the announcement, staff at Lone End office received an email telling them they were doing a fantastic job. The management were happy, and a couple of hours later, they were then told there would be a meeting in the early afternoon. Staff, of course, turned up at this meeting with concerns because they were only too aware of the sweeping cuts the DWP were making. At this meeting, once again, they were told what a wonderful job they were doing and that the office was closing. Told how well you're doing in 1 minute, and the next minute you're told the office is closing. But you will not be aware that I have yet to receive any official correspondence from the UK Government on this. Presiding Officer, Paisley's MSP has not been told of a major closure of a government facility within his constituency. We often hear from opposition benches that there should be respect between the UK and the Scottish Government, but at times like this, it seldom appears to be the case. Last week, during the Social Security Committee, Jamie Hepburn, Minister for Employability and Training, explained to us that he first heard of it through the pages of the Daily Record. It's bad enough that a Tory government has no respect for local parliamentarians, but for them to ignore a Minister of the Scottish Government is shocking and shows the contempt that they treat this institution with. One of the other issues I have is, due to this ill-thought-out closure scheme, is the fact that they're taking away a support mechanism for our communities. The universal credit experiment appears to have been an unmitigated disaster for the UK Government. As a member of the Social Security Committee, I visited people in Musselburgh to take part and see how this Tory experiment has gone. But sorry, Presiding Officer, they believe it's a pilot programme. But the quickest time for a claimant to receive any form of payments is 8 weeks, and that's if they're lucky. By the time they've accrued rent arrears, and some have chosen to pay their broadband service over food and heat. Because, Presiding Officer, this is the only way you can communicate with the DWP. They can go to their local job centre to try and progress their claim, but staff haven't received the necessary training and help. They've been told to point people towards a computer in the job centre. So not only are people suffering from this Tory ideal, there is also the fact that they're now taking away any form of human contact in the process. No job centre, no telephone centre to get any form of advice. We've all seen the financial devastation that the Tory sanction scheme has brought to our communities. I've had conversations with constituents who have been sanctioned for being minutes late. Imagine what it would be like when there is no local job centre to attend. We need to ask ourselves how this would affect members of our community who live with disabilities. We already are aware that this Tory government are already attacking those with disability in Scotland, but now we find that those with a disability will have another barrier. Mark Griffin has already mentioned this as well. So if you're a disabled person who has to attend a job centre, how are you going to get there? You may have already lost your DLA PIP, or at least the mobility component of that, so you'll need to get a bus. Bearing in mind this journey could be anywhere between 3 and 6 miles, that may prove challenging. As Inclusion Scotland states in their very interesting brief for this debate, not all of disabled people affected will be able to travel by public transport. Some wheelchair users may not be able to find an accessible bus on which to make the journey. Even where buses are accessible, 2 wheelchair users could not travel on the same route at the same time, an occurrence which would become more likely when the services are concentrated in fewer locations. So once again, there has been no thought given to those with a disability, but should we not just expect that, presiding officer, from this lot in Westminster? I think
I've already said I don't like the word "this lot," so I'll keep to what I've said to other people.
But I would like to, well, I get very passionate about this, presiding officer, when people are being attacked by this government.
You can be passionate and be polite, Mr. Adam. You can be passionate and polite.
But I would like to return to the DWP office in Paisley, the loss of 300 jobs to our town. How can this Tory government justify this closure when the staff were told how good the job they were doing, and this call centre was promised that they would receive the calls for the universal credit rollout? Can I say, presiding officer, from my interaction with the people in Musselburgh, this is exactly the type of facility that is needed. The UK government claim that people use different channels of digital communication. One gentleman I met in Musselburgh did that. His form of digital communication was a large mobile telephone, not the best way to complete a complex form. This whole process is a sham and should be thought through again. Presiding officer, it's time for this shambles to be addressed by the UK government. They cannot withdraw this valuable support to the people within our community. I joined the SNP in 1987 to protect my community from an uncaring right-wing Tory government. The world has changed, presiding officer, but unfortunately the Tories have not. They're happily to sacrifice the people of my community for their ideals. But one thing they won't stop is my love for my town and the people I represent. As long as I have a breath in my body, I will continue to fight to protect my community from the ongoing heartless attacks from this Tory government.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adam. And there was passion. Gordon Lyndhurst, we're followed by Ross Greer, please. Mr. Lyndhurst.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The strength of feeling associated with this debate, which also we've just heard from our colleague George Adam, exemplifies the work that job centres do in communities. They assist people in need of help. It is crucially important in all of this to recognise the good efforts of hard-working staff up and down the country, and that should not be lost in the rhetoric which often surrounds debates in this chamber. But secondly, it is also important to remember the context out of which consideration of job centre closures have arisen. That context is the natural end of contracts in place with the DWP for many of its offices. And this provides an opportunity to reassess the whole provision of services, not at this stage. This provides an opportunity to reassess the whole provision of services and where and how these are best delivered in the modern internet world of the 21st century. That reassessment, of course, merits the most careful scrutiny. As a member of the Social Security Committee, along with other members of that committee, I have had the opportunity to raise issues with representatives from the DWP. And it is encouraging that following our committee meeting on 15th December last year, the Department responded to concerns expressed by myself and others on that committee, and they did so by lengthening the existing consultation period in relation to job centre closures in Glasgow. Today's government motion, of course, comes in a very different time and context to that in which many of the offices under discussion originally opened in 1998. We are now firmly entrenched in a digital age. I'll take an intervention on this occasion.
Ash Denham.
I thank the member for giving way in this instance. The member may be aware that I actually wrote to Ruth Davidson on this issue and asked her to stand up for her constituents over a job centre closure in Edinburgh. She did actually write back to me, but I have to say I was not overly comforted by the contents of this letter. Surely now is the time for Conservative members to stop just accepting plans that look really good from an office in Whitehall and instead stand up for their constituents' reality on the ground and join with us and oppose these closures.
Gordon Lyndhurst.
The Conservatives will indeed stand up for their constituents, and that is not by simply carrying on regardless of the realities of the situation. And I return to what I was saying to explain my position on this by saying we are not in 1998 now. We are now firmly entrenched in a digital age which follows a complete revolution driven by the internet. We cannot ignore computer literacy, not at this stage. We cannot ignore computer literacy as an essential tool for Scotland's workforce. This applies equally to services that the DWP provide. 80% of claims for job seekers allowance, no. 99.6% of applications for universal credit are made online. Moving services online can help to provide a more efficient service, and it can also provide claimants with an opportunity to interact using skills and practices needed to survive in the modern workforce. Provided, no. Provided, of course, that these are backed up by sufficient support. But a direct consequence is the underutilisation of face-to-face services that require physical office space. No. With over 3 million square feet of space going unused in current offices, a review of the DWP estate is an absolute necessity. Co-location, and I'm pleased to hear the Minister is interested in this, may be an option here with a chance for additional services to be provided within the same building, such as health and other public services, as reflected in the Scottish Conservative amendment, which I support. The Scottish Government should consider how Skills Development Scotland, or indeed the Scottish Social Security Agency, could link up services. No, not at this stage. However, as my colleague Adam Tompkins has pointed out, we need specific proposals, and the Minister was unable to name any, which are put to the UK Government to actually develop co-location. I'll allow an intervention from the Minister.
Jamie Hepburn.
It's remarkably generous of you. Surely you would concede, Mr Lyndhurst, though it's rather difficult to come up with specific propositions for specific areas when the UK Government doesn't let us know what areas they're considering closing a job centre in.
Gordon Lyndhurst.
I haven't seen the terms of the letter from which a partial quotation was given earlier on, so I can't comment on what the stage of discussions are between the Minister and the UK Government. A few matters which, of course, need to be borne in mind. Flexibility, the use of work coaches. I'm running out of time here due to the number of interventions, taken and not taken. And I hope that the Scottish Government will work constructively with the DWP in trying to make this a reality. So there are many things to be welcomed from the UK Government. The 2,500 new work coaches, because it is people that matter, not so much the buildings. People are not made for buildings, but buildings for people.
I have quite a finish, Mr Lyndhurst. I call on Ross Greer to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I start, I have to say that every Conservative speech so far in this debate has been an absolute disgrace. They've hidden behind smoke and mirrors, technical language. They've talked the debate out. Not one of them has been willing to say that if Annie Wells's grand aspirations for DWP extra provisions aren't met, they will stand with us and actually oppose these job centre cuts. It is cowardly, cowardly behaviour. What the Tories have done to job seekers and others who rely on social security in this country is nothing short of despicable. Job centres are meant to be institutions to help people, to help them into work, to access training. If Mr Tompkins wants to say something, he should stand up and I'll reject him like every Conservative speaker has rejected me so far. They are supposed to help people to start their own business, to claim the benefits that they're entitled to. The Conservatives at Westminster, though, and I have to say aided by the Liberal Democrats from 2010 to 15, have bastardised this concept. They have turned an institution designed to help people into an environment of hostility, mistrust and threats. The sanctions handed out to people looking for work are a stain on the reputation of the UK. They are devastating for the individuals and the families that have been victims of them. And the reasons behind these sanctions are often completely ridiculous. A man sanctioned because he missed an appointment because he was taking his wife to the hospital because she'd gone into labour prematurely. Someone unable to attend their workfare placement because the transport is too expensive, and of course you're not paid for the workfare programme, despite them having offered to work at a branch closer to them. A mother of two sanctioned for a month because she was 5 minutes late to an appointment at the job centre. There are many, many more examples which have appeared across newspapers, in broadcast media, in our inboxes and at our surgeries over recent months and years. What the Tories have created is a system designed to block access to the support that people are entitled to and to make their lives harder when they are most in need of that support. There is even evidence to suggest that job centres were directed to intentionally increase the number of sanctions. You don't need to watch Ken Loach's new film, I, Daniel Blake, to know this, though I would suggest that every member in this Parliament, especially our Conservative colleagues, watch what is a devastatingly realistic story of life inside the UK welfare system. Sanctions have a real human impact. The number of people dying prematurely who have been sanctioned, including suicides, is far too high. Whilst numbers are hard to come by, from what we could find, 90 people a month were dying from 2012 to 2014 after having been found fit to work. The number was far higher when you took into account those added to work-related activities. According to the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, this sanctioning regime has constituted a systematic violation of human rights, and it is the Conservatives who are responsible for this, and Conservative members in this Parliament who have been unable or unwilling to defend or condemn it. Thankfully, we will no longer be completely powerless to act in this Parliament. As new social security powers are devolved, we are able to restrict the number of sanctions being issued in Scotland. Work by my colleague Alison Johnson in the Greens found that we can use these powers over the work programme to simply prevent information being passed on that would lead to sanctions. That will save thousands of people in Scotland from that suffering. Yet for the Tories, the chaos of their welfare policy is apparently not enough. Now they want to make people's lives even harder. Now they want to close down job centres, making access to them even more difficult. Recall some of the examples of sanctions that I've already provided. Sanctions because someone was late because they couldn't afford the travel costs. As job centres are closed across Scotland, it will be more difficult for claimants to get the appointments on time, more difficult to carry the cost of transport. People who are already struggling to get by will find it even harder. Some of the proposed closures in Scotland are truly shocking. The implications have either not been considered or they have been, and the government knows exactly what the consequences will be and is deciding to proceed anyway. The closure of the Alexandria jobs... Yes.
Claire Adamson.
I thank the member for taking my intervention. There's been a lot of talk about co-location this afternoon, but does he share my concern that the idea that someone would go to one desk in a building to be sanctioned only to be passed to the next desk to access the Scottish Welfare Fund would be absolutely perverse and let the DWP off the hook on the issue of sanctions?
Ross Greer.
Absolutely. Claire Adamson makes a very important point in this debate. The closure of the Alexandria Job Centre in my region will mean that the most direct route to the nearest job centre in Dumbarton, as Jackie Bailey's already mentioned, is an hour's walk away. For service users in areas like Haldane, it's even further. It is a scenic walk, mind you, given that it involves travelling through a field. I invited the UK Cabinet Minister, Damien Hinds, to join me on this walk. Jackie Bailey's already suggested that. I've already sent him the invitation. I await his reply. I'm sure Jackie Bailey would be happy to join me, but I have a feeling it might just be the two of us. Last month, the Scottish Greens organised a walk from Bridgeton to Shettleston job centres in Glasgow. Again, it's a walk of about an hour or 2 buses if you are able to afford the public transport. And on this walk, Green activists spoke to a number of constituents, all of whom were shocked to hear that the job centres were closing. They had no idea. Now, that walk was possible for fit and healthy green activists and councillors. It's not possible for many of the people who have to use the services of a job centre, those with young children, those with disabilities, those with health conditions.
Come to a close, please, Mr Greer.
The examples that we've already given compare nothing to what the people on Benbecula will have to face. These proposals are plainly ridiculous. They will only cause further pain. They are not being consulted on, and they must be opposed, including by Conservative members of this Parliament.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Sandra White.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I commend the Government for this excellent motion and indeed Labour's amendment. We will be supporting both this evening. The Jobcentre Plus network has been and remains an essential physical edifice for social security and employability in our society. It has connected untold millions with work and career opportunities. In the first 20 seconds, not quite. I will make some progress. I'll take you later, Mr Tompkins. It has connected untold millions with work and career opportunities whilst bringing help and access to those who rely on financial assistance of the state in times of economic inactivity. We can trace the Job Centre back to the Labour Exchange Act of 1909. It was a liberal construct under the government of Asquith, the first effort by a national administration to seek to connect the labour market with opportunities for work and foster that most liberal of principles, social mobility. I'll take Professor Tompkins.
Adam Tompkins.
I just wanted to make sure that the member was in the right debate because there is no Labour amendment for him to support this evening.
Apologise.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'll take that on the chin. I'll take you back to 1909, though, and in the second reading of that bill, Lord DL, a Liberal peer, said of the creation of the Labour Exchange, "I do not think it necessary for me to elaborate in any way the great distress and misery which arise from lack of work." And he went on, "Relief works cannot seriously be regarded as a cure for unemployment. At best, they are only palliative. What is wanted is not a drug to still the pain of disease, but a cure which will reach deep into the roots." And that, in that sentence, was the creation of the Labour Exchange movement. At every stage in the 11 decades that have followed, over the course of 2 world wars, 8 recessions, the ebb and flow of industrialisation, urbanisation and automation, the Labour Exchange and subsequently the Job Centre network has been a lodestone in our nation's efforts to bring work and not rather than charity and by extension hope to the masses. Now, I'm not denying in any way that over the course of its history, circumstances haven't shifted, and the inexorable shift towards online service provision in some cases has reduced footfall, and thereby in some cases the business case for some of that sector. But news from the DWP that as part of the 2015 spending review, it would renegotiate all Job Centre Plus tenancies has come as a hammer blow of concern to those communities which stand in the backwash and churn between hard times and prosperity. Yes, the DWP are right to point out to the fact that 8 out of 10 JSA claimants, almost all universal credit applications are made online, but by dint of the strictures, so whilst this is maybe closing a gateway to social security, the role it can still serve in terms of that vital role of connecting people to work and skills development, that vital face-to-face connection, is as important as it ever was. I turn my argument at this point back to the words of Lord DL in 1909 when he said to define the work of the exchange, its object is the same of that of any other exchange, to bring buyer and seller together. And I think that if it did nothing more, then it would amply justify its existence. Those words ring as true. I will on this point.
Ross Greer.
I thank Mr Cole-Hamilton for taking the intervention. I'm enjoying his reaching back into history, but looking to a more recent era of history, is he proud of his party's record in government with the Conservatives, expanding a sanctions regime through the job centres?
Fine.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Well, I always welcome Ross Greer's intervention, but I think that's a bit of a cheap shot considering we were the tempering influence on what this government is now doing on an unbridled basis. Thank you for shattering the consensus of this debate, Mr Greer. The fact is, Presiding Officer, that it is very hardest to reach who will be worst affected, as we have heard, and we have consensus on that, by this retrograde step. We will be ripping the very ladders of social mobility out of some of the most deprived communities in our society, and at a time when we could be on the verge of needing them like never before. And what baffles me is that this Tory government, so fond of the adage, let's mend the roof while the sun shines, looks to strip the timbers of this canopy on the basis of some short-term and transit employment figures. All this this when we stand on the precipice of uncertainty that Brexit represents. The prudence of the Conservative Party does not, it seems, extend to the needs adrift of the labour market. And I see no evidence of a plan to scale up support should that event happen in the event of economic calamity. We all remember the famous words of Norman Tebbit. I grew up in the 1930s, he said, with an unemployed father. We didn't riot, we got on his bike and he looked for work. In that couplet, we see the metal of Tory ideology in this regard. But, presiding officer, it is much harder to get on your bike and look for work if you are in a wheelchair, or if you, as you have heard this afternoon, are more than 2 bus rides away from the nearest job centre. That is why the equalities impact assessment, rightly proposed by the government, is so essential in any service redesign. But it is not to justify just the physical proximity of the job centres, of those farthest for the labour market that matters. It is the local knowledge, personal one-to-one advice, internet access and wraparound services that makes this support so effective. At a time when economic inactivity impacts on those who are impeded by a range of social barriers, we must not blindly remove local access to the exchange of labour, and by so doing erect still further barriers to employment and social mobility. Thank you.
Sandra White, to be followed by Bill Bowman.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I was slightly confused by Mr Cole-Hamilton's contribution. I did try and intervene. I'm not sure now, is he definitely supporting the Conservatives' amendment or not? I'm sure you're not supporting it. Oh, he's not supporting it, although he did say it first. I just wanted to clarify myself on that particular point. Presiding Officer, so therefore I can add Mr Cole-Hamilton to my thanks to all of the colleagues, apart from the Tories, who have given a contribution tonight. I thought they were all excellent contributions and very thoughtful contributions also. We also had contributions from various organisations, to centres, stuff to look at, and obviously individuals also. But I do have a special thanks for the Evening Times in Glasgow, who have been running with this constantly. Great coverage and much welcome support against these actual closures and the proposals for the closures. It will have a devastating effect in people throughout Scotland. In my own area, I do not have job centre closures, but I do have back offices closures. And one of them it's Portcullis House and Cadogan House. And one is very, very serious. The Cadogan House is where people go for medical assessments. Now, I wonder what will happen then if it closes down and we have job centres closing down also. Where will these people be going for medical assessments? That's a real worry in that respect. And it will hit the most vulnerable people in society. And in most cases, many cases, all cases, it will have the opposite effect of helping people back into work. And I think I echo what others have said tonight as well, from the Labour and other benches as well, that this really indeed is not about helping people back into work. This is about saving money. And it shows the Tories for what they actually are. Basically, they have no thought for the people in Glasgow or in Scotland. Their only thought is to save money. And basically, from what I can see, whatever Westminster says, they do. And if I could just turn to the amendment. Well, we talk about amendments. When you actually look at the amendment, I call it a feeble amendment. It certainly is a feeble amendment. A change of 2 words. 2 words. I wonder how long it took Mr Tompkins to do that. Has been said already, a change from will have to may have. That's a lot of thinking for somebody who's been academic to do that. And then in the next very last line, we in the government's motion calls on the DWP to halt the closures to allow the Scottish Government to bring forward substantial co-location proposals to save these job centres. I think that's pretty eminently sensible to put that in. I don't see anything wrong at all with that. But of course, they've got to take that out and they replace it with calls on the Scottish Government to make plain his proposals as to how skills development in Scotland, I won't go on about the rest, proposed Social Security Agency, etc. I mean, there's an awful lot of thought went into that, hasn't it? Absolutely none at all. And for the evidence, and Mr Tompkins knows this, being on the committee, from the evidence we have got, the DWP, Damien Green and the rest of them, they don't care what happens in Scotland and to the poor folk that are in Glasgow or in Scotland, because they don't even reply to your letters. We write to them saying, we asked you about something, they don't reply, and then all of a sudden you read it in the newspapers that job centres are closing. You know, that's how they treat us here. And I think it's about time the Tories actually realise that. And, you know, Mr Tompkins is very fond of talking about the House of Commons Work and Pensions Committee and how good it is and how it was all party, etc., etc. Well, indeed, I mean, it mentioned in that response, open to working in ways which are increasingly flexible and adaptable. Well, I think that sounds quite good. I don't think any of us would say we had any qualms about that. But adaptable and flexible doesn't mean shutting 50% of the job centres in Glasgow down. That's not flexible, that's not adaptable, with nothing in its place. So yeah, you can quote what you like, Mr Tompkins, but the very fact of the matter is they didn't really care about the people in Glasgow or in Scotland. And it also mentions the fact that, yes, the DWP was wanting to save money and it wanted to close job centres, but it called for 20% across the UK. It didn't say close 50% in Glasgow. Now, really, that is detrimental to Glasgow and the rest of Scotland. And it's about time the Tories actually stood up and told people the truth. You can pick out what you like, but that's the actual truth. 50% of the job centre closures are going to be in Glasgow. I'll give you.
John Mason. Would the member accept it's 75% in the East End, 3 closing out of 4?
I do accept that. Thank you. I do accept that, and John Mason's absolutely right. And others have mentioned before about the 450 all-day bus fare. I mean, I'm very fortunate in my Kelvin constituency. I have the job centre in Partick, which isn't closing, but I have the 2 city centre ones which do medical assessments. But in cases such as with John Mason's and other areas such as Castlemilk and Bob Doris's area also, yes, the bus service, the train service isn't all that great, and people don't have the money to travel back and forth. And that's what they should be told. So please, none of this false tears and false weeping from the Tories opposite here. They know exactly what's going on. It's just a pity that they, when they're supposedly writing to the Westminster government and we don't get replies, we don't get the reply. It's a pity we don't work in co-location with the job centres and where they're going to be put, because we'd like to know as much as anybody else. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
I call Bill Bowman to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Well, thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Just in case any of you can't stay for the whole speech, on the Ross Greer scale, I think I will probably be a disgrace and despicable by the end. And I shall apply Lyndhurst's law of only taking interruptions when I'm drinking water. And my glass seems to be pretty empty anyway. There's a but however, I do still welcome the opportunity to speak in today's debate on the future of the Jobcentre Plus network here in Scotland, one that follows on from the earlier debate that we had about the Glasgow job centres. Now, I think, as we know, the House of Commons Work and Pensions Committee produced a report on this subject, and on page 3, the report's summary makes it explicitly clear that the future of Jobcentre Plus is one of change. Now, we may not all agree on what change looks like, but it is vital that the public services adapt to reflect the changing needs of the people that they serve. Now, I can't go back to 1909 in a quote, but I can go back half a century to President Kennedy, who spoke in 1963 in Frankfurt, and I think summed this up quite well. Change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future. Now, this is exactly what these changes are about, creating a fit-for-purpose network of job centres that are better able to meet the needs of those who require them most. Now, I'm sure everyone in this chamber... Let me make a little bit more progress, thank you. So this is exactly what these changes are about, creating a fit-for-purpose network that are able to meet the needs of those who require them most. We welcome the fact that the number of people needing to use a job centre has fallen. The number of people now in work across the UK is 31.8 million, which is more than... Let me please just make a little bit more progress. That's a maybe later. As I was saying, the number of people now in work across the UK is now 31.8 million, which is more than just a statistic. It is 32 million people going home with a pay packet in their pocket, able to provide for themselves and their families or dependents as they have. Now, I mentioned this when I made my maiden speech. that there is no better feeling or sense of satisfaction than being able to look after your family and...
Jamie Hepburn or Alex Cole-Hamilton, which? Oh.
No, I'm your preference over Mr Cole-Hamilton. That's very instructive. Mr Bowman seems to be, incidentally, he refers to those who are in employment. Of course, this debate is about those who are in unemployment and how we can better support them to get into employment. He suggests that these proposals are about making the Jobcentre Plus network better purposed for the future. I wonder if you could tell us if that's informed by any discussion or dialogue whatsoever with service users that the proposed job centres are going to close.
Bill Bowman.
Well, I was going on to say that, however, there are too many people out of work who do need and require the facilities and services offered by the Jobcentre Plus network. Now, here in Scotland, according to the latest ONS labour market briefing, the picture is a bit bleaker. There is an unemployment rate of 5.1%, below that of Northern Ireland's 5.6%, certainly, but above England and Wales. Now, I know, Presiding Officer, it is the case in this chamber that some members occasionally like to blame Westminster for what happens here, but the reality is a little different, as made clear last week when the SNP's budget was given a last-minute kiss of life by the Greens. Instead of growing our economy and putting more people back to work, the SNP and the Greens opted for a budget that will slash local services and make this country the highest taxed part of the UK. A regressive move that will do anything but encourage businesses to set up and expand here.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm very grateful to the member for giving way. Does he accept that the impact of Brexit and the resultant slide of our economy may well prevent many businesses from setting up in this country, and that's entirely the result of his government?
Bill Bowman.
No. Presiding Officer, I have a background in business and commerce, and in public services, as in businesses, it is important to look at how things can be done better. Without repeating what has been said in the debate a few weeks ago, like my colleagues Adam Tompkins and Annie Wells, I neither condone nor condemn the DWP's proposals in Glasgow. They, Annie Wells and Adam Tompkins, have raised concerns in the consultation and with the relevant ministers. But we need to understand that the labour market is changing, and we all want the Jobcentre Plus network that provides a more tailored support where possible. This has been brought out in earlier speeches. There is a key point in the Commons Select Committee report. This is a key point in the Commons Committee report, which was accepted by the members of that committee, including Mary Black, a name you will recognise. It reflects the changing nature of the world we live in. 8 out of 10 claims for job seekers allowance, and as previously mentioned, 99.6% of applicants for universal credit submit their claims online. I'm not suggesting that means that job centres are no longer needed, and I fully accept that not everyone has easy access to a computer or the internet. But it does mean that the numbers of people who need to visit the job centre is less than it was. A lot have been said about the DWP's proposals and their aim to deal with the significant amount of underused space that the estate has. But the other aim is to give people the chance to visit a single building that offers a number of government services, a social hub, if you like. Presiding Officer, I want to conclude by thanking those who work
I think you should, Mr. Bowman.
Well, I am.
Well, hurry up.
Up and down the country. They do a fantastic job in equipping people with the advice they need to go back to work, and I believe it is right that the Parliament acknowledges that, and thank you for the time to say that.
I call Fulton McGregor to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Like many others who have already spoken, I was shocked and disappointed by the decision announced a week or so ago about the further job centre closures in Glasgow and throughout Scotland. This is just another long line of decisions taken by the distant and remote Tory party in London with no regard for the real people, the surrounding businesses and the local communities that are involved and affected. These proposed closures are sure to have a devastating effect on the most disadvantaged and vulnerable members of our society, as many speakers have already said, and many of these who are already living in poverty as austerity kicks in. For many vulnerable individuals, the processes of sanctions and Difficulty maintaining appointments due to health worries and disability are already a challenge enough without these further barriers. It is very clear that these changes implemented by Westminster are not made with the people in mind, and it is also clear that this UK Government has absolutely no ambition for lifting those most in need out of poverty and into work. Yet this decision to close job centres is, for my constituency, something that has already happened. Before my time as an MSP, I may add, January 2006, in fact. The job centre in Coatbridge, one of the most impoverished areas in our country, was closed down by a UK Government, then under a Labour guise, ignorant to the changing needs of its old industrial heartlands. Service users in my constituency are now redirected to job centres in Airdrie, Bellshill and for some Cumbernauld, with no additional contribution to travel costs being made. For some users, this is a bus trip they would never have had to previously make, and when money is tight, as so often the case when seeking employment, these additional expenses can become problematic. And it is in these sorts of decisions that can impact in many other areas of people's lives, including, for example, mental health. And I'll take this opportunity briefly to highlight that later today I'm hosting a reception for Sam H in the Garden Lobby, an organisation that does fantastic work throughout Scotland, including my constituency, and I hope members across the chamber are able to come along. As I said, many of my constituents who are job seekers are now redirected elsewhere, and I took the opportunity to visit Airdrie Job Centre last week. I was meant to go with a colleague, Alex Neil, MSP, however, as the Chamber will know, he's off unwell at the moment, and so I'll take this opportunity to wish him a speedy recovery. While I was there, I met with District Manager Etta Wright and a group of the job coaches. The visit was very encouraging, and it was clear to see what an excellent and dynamic service the enthusiastic staff offer at the centre. And I'm glad that others, including Bob Doris, have mentioned that. They spoke of how dedicated the team were to ensuring that service delivery remains and continues to be customer-focused, something that I think the Job Centre can be very proud of. The work ethic of the job coaches was something that really struck me, and it was obvious to see that the employees there really care about the people that come through the doors. It's just a real pity that people need to travel, sometimes from the back of Coatbridge, over 5 miles away to get there. And unfortunately, the closure of the Job Centre is not where this story for Coatbridge ends. What Thatcher started in the 1980s, when she savaged old industries like closing the steelworks at the Calder where my granddad worked, what Blair's Labour continued by hitting us while we were down with closure to the Job Centre, as mentioned, this new crop of Tory London-based MPs are taking it even further again. The UK Government have now gone and announced the closure of the DWP processing unit at South Circular Road in Coatbridge. And it's no wonder people in my constituency wanted self-determination in 2014 by voting yes after years of a UK Government so out of touch with our needs and continuing to heap misery on our area. But worse, it's the way that, as others have said, this whole situation has been handled. Just under 2 weeks ago, I received a worried message from one of my constituents who's employed at the centre and has worked there for years. She told me that she had just been told that the unit would be closing next year at the latest, and she would be moved to Motherwell or Glasgow. No prior consultation at all. I had received no notification of this from the DWP, only later getting the tokenistic letter from Damien Hines MP confirming by at that stage I already knew. Both the MP in the area, Phil Boswell, and I have now had conversations with the union reps, and I have set up a meeting with the manager, Alan Bowman, for the 6th of March to ensure that staff are fully supported. I have also written to the Secretary of State of Work and Pensions to urge him to halt these summary closures of the services throughout Scotland. Approximately 234 staff will be affected in Coatbridge, with the vast majority from the town itself. Coatbridge Main Street has been struggling under North Lanarkshire Council rates for years, and with the closure of the DWP Processing Centre, coupled with the recently announced closure of the Airdrie Savings Bank at the Fountain, the remaining local businesses of the Main Street will feel the pressure more than ever. The situation is getting beyond a joke, as highlighted by a recent article in the Airdrie and Coatbridge Advertiser, and I have now taken steps to set up a public meeting to involve local traders and other partners to find a way to stem this tide. Last week there was a heritage debate in this chamber, and it was good to hear the history of my town being praised by other MSPs across the various parties. But there is a more fundamental story here. Tory governments have ripped the heart out of these communities, and slowly but surely the SNP and this government, and I don't mind saying that, are trying to help get them back together. My constituency wants full control and self-determination, and make no mistake about it, the attacks from this UK government on the areas that had the biggest yes votes are no coincidence. This may well be a real-life example of the Empire Strikes Back. Presiding Officer, this is why I commend the motion put forward by the Minister and ask for a reversal of these decisions. Thank you.
Pauline McNeill, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Presiding Officer, the case for job centre closures has not been made. A child can see that it is the lease arrangements of the DWP coming to an end that are driving the consultation, and they're working backwards to justify it, because none of the rationale I've heard so far in any way meets the test of the needs of the people who rely on job centres. It is an attack on the jobless. That's what it feels like to me. And it feels like an attack on a city like Glasgow. The Tories say the best route out of poverty is to get a job, and I agree with that. But people need their job centres to help them get that route to a job. So if the aspiration of the DWP is to create a new system, it's a fair argument. But can the Tories not see that it is out of step with the needs of Glaswegians, certainly, and from other poorer cities? The closures we've heard will compound poverty, it compounds hardship, it will add cost to almost every single person affected by it. The transport difficulties we've heard are not imagined, they will be real. And I believe they'll cause ill health to many people who are going to worry about how they get their extra bus, how they travel much further if these job centres were to close. So, as we've heard, nationally is a 20% cut in job centres. But when it comes to Glasgow, we're going to be losing half if the consultation does not conclude in a different way. In places like Bridgeton and Parkhead and Easterhouse, they are in the top 5 to 10% of the most deprived areas in the country. And they're served by 3 job centres which face closure. The rationale we've heard is that there's a move to online, that as I've said, the 20-year lease arrangements have come to an end, and apparently the claimant figures are dropping, and I want to address that point later. But Bill Bowman, who quotes John F. Kennedy in a rather kind of out-of-step quote from the actual debate, and I'd ask him in all seriousness to listen to what, well, I can only speak for Glasgow, that's the city I know. Maybe you're not familiar with this, but online digital access for Glaswegians is the lowest uptake anywhere in the country. Half of Glaswegians have no computer at home at all. So how's the DWP's aspirations ever going to be met right now? And 7 out of 10 actually need support in surveys that have been done to help them online. Glasgow is not ready for this change. It is completely out of step. It's not an anti-DWP argument. It's plain to see, and I'll take an intervention from the Minister.
Jamie Hepburn.
Very much concur with the point that she has made about the problems people in Glasgow and indeed other areas have accessing IT facilities. What I heard very clearly was in Maryhill, and it will be the same in other areas, is that people actually rely on their local job centre to access IT facilities. So I wonder if she would agree with me this is a counterproductive move in this regard.
Pauline McNeill.
That is exactly the point I'm making. Perhaps we in the future, I don't disagree that there might be a beneficial aspiration to go online, but it is out of step with people's experiences on the ground, and the DWP must take account of that in the consultation. Other members have talked about, well, there are solutions, and I want to address Annie Wells' points. Maybe there are solutions. But the Tories can't just hide behind the fig leaf of the process. That's all we've heard, and that's what the amendment addresses. Annie Wells makes some very good points. But, I mean, is there any serious prospect that the DWP will seriously look at this? But bear this in mind, that claimants will still require to sign on every 2 weeks. So satellites are not going to be an answer for that. And perhaps you'd like to address that point. I'd like to move on to the spin that the Tories have had in the previous debate about this figure of 44%. Now, I begin by accepting that it is a true figure. But you must consider that the figures that were being used by the Tories in this debate are the figures from 2010 until 2016. Most people accept that the post-crash, financial crash figures show a blip in unemployment figures. If you look at the figures for 2016, they've pretty much settled now to the figures that they were before the crash. I would ask the Tories to take this into consideration. The claimant count is accounted for in that way, and it really is unfair to use that as one of the justifications for closing Glasgow's job centres. It simply cannot just be about the process. We've heard many others talk about visits they've made to job centres. In my visits to both Partick and Castlemilk job centres, it's quite clear when some of the poorest people live in Castlemilk that they will have to take 3 buses in order to attend Newlands Job Centre, which is the nearest one to them. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, if there is any real consensus amongst the parties here to fight these job centre closures, and I think there is an imperative here to win, then there must be some meeting of the way between certainly the Tory MSPs representing Glasgow, because unless you're prepared to condemn some of these closures, I don't really see how the DWP will simply listen to the rest of us. I think there needs to be some recognition in this consultation that already there has been a breach of the DWP's own rules if you look at the travel arrangements. There must be a single message from this Parliament. This level of job closures is out of step with the needs of the people of Scotland.
We move to the last of the open debate speeches, and that's Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, if the UK Government and the DWP seriously believe that work is the best route out of poverty, then it must be made as easy as possible for people to actually enter the workplace, not more difficult. It's also important to think about the impact that closing job centres will actually have on surrounding services. But also, job centre staff are already facing increased pressure with the rollout of universal credit, increased conditionality for lone parents and also people in work, and the increasing digitalisation of social security. My constituency of Great Inverclyde has long-term high levels of deprivation, and closing the job centre in Port Glasgow will not improve this situation. The MSPs from across the chamber have explained the process thus far, so I'm not going to go over that ground again. I'm going to focus my attention on my constituency. Now, first of all, I do welcome the announcement that the 28 staff at the Port Glasgow Job Centre will not be losing their jobs. They are to be redeployed to the Great Job Centre. And secondly, I welcome the announcement that those claiming GISA and the equivalent universal credit at the Port Glasgow Job Centre will get their travelling expenses paid for additional meetings above their fortnightly scheduled meeting. But the obvious question on this point is, for how long will this take place? Also, if the target is to save £180 million, how does paying for travelling expenses help save that money? Now, we know that the UK National Audit Office indicated that the cost of administering the sanctioning system is £285 million per annum, whilst the UK Government expect it to save £132 million from sanctioning GISA and ESA claimants. And we also have to wonder, therefore, why the UK debt mountain is at £1.8 trillion and the deficit is £68.2 billion, with policies like that introduced by the Tory Government. Now, the Tory Government claims it needs fewer offices to cover the UK because people tend to submit their claims for benefits online. Now, Gordon Lyndhurst failed to accept the point that many people don't have the access to technology, whereas at least Bill Bowman he had the grace to actually appreciate that point. But not everyone is that way inclined, and if someone is older, has a visual impairment and isn't tech-savvy, then the so-called old-fashioned way is absolutely vital. Now, this was a point that was raised last year to Jean Freeman MSP, the Scottish Government's Social Security Minister, when she was speaking at the RNAB Scotland Fringe event at the SNP conference. However, as we know, Presiding Officer, unemployment claimants are still required to attend job centres at least every 2 weeks, with the UK Government having trialled weekly sign-ons and even more intensive daily sign-ons. The fact that the DWP Work Services Director for Scotland, Denise Horsfall, admitted that no one has tested the distance and time claimants will need to travel when job centres close, and said it was done using Google Maps, is quite frankly shameful and an insult to everyone who's going to be adversely affected. It takes absolutely no consideration of the particular circumstances of each community. It takes no consideration of the topography, the geography, the demographics and the long-term nature of unemployment in our communities. 3 miles away It may be a walkable distance in good weather or for those who are fit and healthy, but for others this is going to be another significant barrier. Putting additional barriers in the way to getting into employment is a ridiculous position to be in, and the Tories in this chamber, and particularly those who represent the west of Scotland, and there's a couple in this chamber today, they should be ashamed of their party down in London for introducing this particular policy, and ask them to stand up for their constituents, make sure this doesn't happen. Presiding Officer, yesterday, the common word used by the Tories in the Article 50 debate was grievance. Now, I do have a grievance. I confess I've got a grievance against Westminster. I've got a grievance against Westminster policies that are punitive. I've got a grievance against a political elite who give little consideration to those people who need the assistance. I do have a grievance against Westminster that has led to long-term unemployment in constituencies like mine. The eradication of the manufacturing base in Inverclyde in the 70s and 80s has led to my community struggling, but now beginning to move forward. However, Inverclyde currently has 41 data zones and the 15% most deprived in Scotland. This equates to 36% of Inverclyde's data zones featuring in the 15% most deprived in the country. That's not a record Westminster should be proud of. Despite the tens of millions of pounds ploughed into Inverclyde via the creation of the Urban Regeneration Company, Riverside Inverclyde, the hundreds of new homes built by the housing associations, the new schools being built via the local authority and the Scottish Government, and the investment by businesses determined to make a success in Inverclyde, things are still tough. It just goes to show how bad Westminster was to my constituency and the catch-up job this Parliament and Government has got it in its hands trying to move all of Inverclyde forward. Both income and employment deprivation continue to be higher in Inverclyde than Scotland as a whole. Inverclyde also has a higher proportion of people who are economically inactive due to a long-term health condition or disability than most other local authorities in Scotland. That means that there will also be a higher proportion of JSA and ESA claimants in Inverclyde with a limiting disability who are required to attend job seeker interviews. For as long as the sanctions regime continues to punish people for even slight lateness, then the closure of job centres may ultimately lead to more people being unduly penalised. I also have a grievance against that, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, the fact is the closures of job centres around the country have more to do with a Tory agenda to penalise the most disadvantaged in our communities than it is to do with requirement. Austerity isn't inevitable or even advisable, as IMF and OECD and others will tell you. And the closure of job centres in disadvantaged communities are now the next victim of the draconian austerity agenda by this Tory government, something even Margaret Thatcher didn't fully manage to do. Thank you very much.
We now move to the closing speeches, and I call Anna Sarwar. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think we've had a very good debate today, a very difficult issue, of course, which I hope will bring as much cross-party consensus as we can in this chamber. There's also been some surreal moments in the chamber this afternoon. Alec Cole-Hamilton and his keenness to support a Lib-Lab coalition, support the Labour amendment that didn't exist. If only, Alec, there was more of you and more of us, that perhaps could be a reality. We learnt from Gordon Lyndhurst that he is indeed Mr. No. We also heard from Ross Greer, who seemed to give an invitation of sorts to Jackie Bailey, which made me think of the song Just the Two of Us. And I was particularly delighted to hear the implication that the brains of the front bench of the Conservative Party was intellectually challenged by Sandra White. So that was a pleasure also. And we also heard from Bill Bowman. I've heard of people being a glass half empty type of person or a glass half full type of person. I think we know that Bill Bowman is just a glass empty type of person. But moving on to the seriousness of the debate today, Deputy Presiding Officer, I want to first of all put on record, like the Minister has done before me, our thanks to all our DWP staff and all our job centre staff, many of them who have a thankless task in really challenging circumstances. And I know other people in our public services do get the recognition, for example, in our NHS, and I think it's important that we say thanks to all our DWP and job centre staff too, who are obviously anxious at this time as well. And I'm delighted to say I stand shoulder to shoulder with Jamie Hepburn and the SNP government on this issue of job centres. I think the motion in the name of the Minister is actually very balanced and very fair. It makes a plea for a dialogue with the UK government. It makes a plea for consideration around co-location, and it makes a plea to give more time to halt these closures and give more time for the Scottish Government to see what it can do to support local people and local job centres. And I hope that's an invitation that the UK Government take very, very seriously and consider. I also want to repeat what Sandra White said. It's thanks to the Evening Times in Glasgow, who have run a phenomenal campaign on this job centre, who have sought to bring all parties together and all elected representatives from all political parties in Glasgow in support of our communities. And in that spirit of cross-party work, I also want to put on record my thanks to Bob Doris, who led a members' debate on this issue a couple of weeks ago, which I was pleased to support. I also want to put on record my thanks to Stuart MacDonald MP, who took the initiative and brought MPs, MSPs and indeed council group leaders together to put a letter to the UK Government to think again on these proposals and to give a direct invitation to the Secretary of State. But I must say, Deputy Presiding Officer, while I welcome this cross-party support on this job centre issue, I do think that we can get more cross-party support more often on issues of importance to the City of Glasgow, whether it be on police closures that we've heard before, whether it be on the hospital closures, for example, the Lightburn Hospital, or indeed the fact that Glasgow's budget has been cut by £377 million since 2007. I would hope that we can find cross-party consensus to not only pick flaws and talk up injustice done by that place, but also to expose injustices done by this place to the people of Glasgow and indeed to other difficult communities. And that's why I welcome George Adams' comment that he will work till his last dying breath to fight these closures. I hope that he will work till his last dying breath on the REH paediatric closure proposals. I hope Stuart Macmillan will fight till his last dying breath for the saviour of the maternity unit at the Inverclyde Royal Hospital, because I think it's important that all elected members, wherever the bad decision is coming, whether that be from a UK government, whether that be from a Scottish government, I would hope that local elected members could work together to defend the communities that they represent. But let's be clear about these job centre proposals. There has been no engagement. It is simply unacceptable for people to read about these things in the newspaper and there to be little or no consultation. I don't think it's acceptable, as Mark Griffin has said, that Ruth Davidson can hide behind other people in this debate. She should speak out about the closure that's happening in her own constituency, but also call out the failures of the UK Government in this regard. And I also don't think, as Polly McNeill has said, that the case has actually been made for these closures. I don't think it's been considered about the impact this has on communities from another uncaring decision from an uncaring government, because we know from history that unemployment is a price worth paying for the Conservative Party, and I don't think that's acceptable. And Ross Greer was right to mention sanctions. This is a government that will sanction people for not turning up for their fortnightly visit. If you make it harder for people to visit, you make it more likely to sanction, and that cannot be acceptable. And that's why I hope we can find some cross-party support on that too. I realise I'm in my last few seconds, Deputy Presiding Officer. All I want to say in closing is that this is a decision that has not been thought through. It's done without any consultation. It's not respected this Parliament. It's not respected local communities. And I would expect better from the UK Government. And I hope David Mundell and I hope the Minister, Mr Hines, will take up the invitation to come directly to these communities, meet local communities and hear for himself why these decisions are wrong and why they should be standing up and defending the most vulnerable people in our communities.
I call on Dean Lockhart. 7 minutes, please, Mr Lockhart.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. We've had a lively debate today and a number of robust contributions across the chamber. There has been also some consensus over the concerns relating to the proposed closures of Job Centre Plus sites across Scotland. There's also clear recognition, and I would like to repeat what a number of members have said, to thank the invaluable work undertaken by DWP staff across Scotland. At the same time, this debate has taken place. A hearing of the Scottish Affairs Committee at Westminster has also been hearing evidence on this very same topic, and I will briefly mention later on some of the issues coming out of that hearing. Let me first turn to the Scottish Government's motion today. It calls on the DWP to provide more detail on the timing, the scope and the rationale for the proposed closures. This has been reflected in a number of contributions from members across the chamber. We've heard from Bob Doris, Jackie Bailey and Annie Wells, amongst others. about feedback they've received from their constituents, concerns expressed by constituents about the closure of their local job centre. We've heard concerns about the insufficient timing and the scope of the public consultation process, and concerns that the internal and the public announcements of the proposals should have been handled better. We agree with many of these concerns, including extending the consultation process to all 8 Glasgow centres. We also agree it's important to balance any proposed changes with continuing to make sure that vulnerable local residents who need additional assistance get that assistance, whether it's because of disability, long-term health conditions or other reasons. And Danny Wells, I thought, set out a number of very good ideas, practical ideas on how this might be taken forward. We hope that this current consultation process, as well as the debates in this chamber and in the House of Commons, will provide the DWP with a full and better understanding. I will in a second, will provide the DWP with a full and a better understanding of these concerns. Presiding Officer, while we agree that more details are required on the timing and the scope of the reorganisation, we do think that the rationale behind the reorganisation has been made clear by the DWP. And before I go on to set out the rationale, I'll take the member's intervention.
Pauline McNeill.
Thank you very much. I'm genuinely interested in the proposals that Annie Well puts forward. It's not something that I would reject outright, but I'd wonder if you would acknowledge that some of the difficulties that members talked about getting to a job centre, if you close all of these job centres, they still have to sign on every 2 weeks. So a satellite arrangement isn't really going to help that.
Dean Lockhart.
I think that goes to the point about the two-way dialogue and the consultation process, and hopefully, as a result of the consultation process, we will see some consensus around some of those practical issues. Let me turn now to the rationale behind the reorganisation, because as the All-Party House of Commons Work and Pensions Committee has said, the future of Jobcentre Plus is one of change, a statement approved by Mary Black MP amongst others. We agree with this, and indeed many of the drivers for this change are actually positive. Across Scotland, the claimant count has declined from 135,000 6 years ago to 81,000 last month. As Adam Tompkins mentioned, the claimant count in Glasgow has declined by 40%. This fall in claimant count across the UK and across Scotland has resulted in underutilisation in the job centre network by as much as 40% in places like Glasgow. One observation coming out of the Scottish Affairs Committee this afternoon was that Glasgow will have more job centres per 1,000 people than Birmingham or Sheffield, even if the proposed closures go ahead. So I think I would recommend to members that they look at the hearing at the Scottish Affairs Committee. And I'm not saying that's a justification for the proposals, but it's an interesting observation. I would like to make a bit of progress. There are other reasons driving the change to the network. The increasing digitalisation of services has resulted in a more accessible welfare system. More than 80% of claims for JSA are made online, and over 99% of applications for universal credit are submitted online. In addition, the introduction of a more... I will later. In addition, the introduction of a more simplified welfare system, such as universal credit, has helped to streamline the system. All of these changes to the welfare system now mean that the DWP needs less than 80% of the office space currently occupied. I'll give way.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Dean Lockhart for taking the intervention. The point I raised in my contribution earlier regarding people who are either blind or visually impaired is absolutely crucial in terms of actually allowing and helping and assisting these people get back into the workplace. If these job centres are not there, how is that going to happen?
Dean Lockhart.
I agree that additional support has to be continued to be made available to those individuals. I absolutely agree with that. Presiding Officer, a number of members have said this reorganisation is about reducing floor space. I actually don't agree. I think there are two much more important elements to this. First, it's about how the DWP can best use its budget to concentrate on helping people who need it most. This plan will save £180 million a year over 10 years. That's up to £2 billion. Rather than spending £2 billion on empty space, the DWP aims to recruit 2,500 additional work coaches in the next period, including 122 new work coaches last year in Scotland and more going forward. I'm sure others, not right now, I'm sure others will agree that this is a much better use of money than spending it on empty space. Secondly, the reorganisation, I will later, the reorganisation is about reflecting the changing demands placed on the Job Centre Plus service, as others have indicated. It recognises that job centres these days are not just about finding jobs, it's about there are places to discuss adult learning issues, skills acquisition, mental health issues, disability issues, as well as benefits, and I'm about to wrap up, as well as social security. So to meet these changing demands, the DWP is not cutting back services, it is expanding the level of services across a different network. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government's motion today suggests it may have co-location proposals that would address some of the issues mentioned above. If that is the case, we would very much welcome these proposals and look forward to hearing the specific details. It has been over 2 months since these changes were first announced. Presiding Officer, let me conclude. We look forward to hearing the outcome of the consultation exercise. We will remain fully engaged with it, and we look forward to an outcome that balances the need for change with the needs of vulnerable people in our local communities. We also look forward to hearing about the co-location proposals coming from the Scottish Government and to seeing a more joined-up working arrangement between the UK Government and the Scottish Government. As our amendment makes clear, this is a two-way process, and we look forward to a closer working relationship. I support the amendment in Adam Tompkins' name.
I call on Jamie Hepburn to close this debate. 9 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you very much, President Officer, and can I thank those who have taken part in today's debate. It's certainly been an opportunity for if not all of us, most of us, to be able to lay out our concerns about the broad thrust of all of the closures, but certainly for individual members where there are specific closures in their areas to raise the very real concerns they have. I thought it would be a useful place to start at the outset of my closing contribution, President Officer, to start at the logical place, start at the beginning. Let's look at the process that has led us to where we are today. Adam Tompkins, in his opening remarks, said it was sensible to review the estate, for the DWP to review their Jobcentre Plus estate. I don't disagree with that per se. I'm not convinced that anyone has said anything that would disagree with that perspective. He gave the example that the Annie's Land office is 1/3 empty. There's 2 floors unused. And of course, many of, I think all of the Conservative members spoke of the fact that the lease arrangements are coming to an end. Well, let me be clear though, I accept that all might be the case, certainly the case in relation to the leases coming to an end, but that is not an argument for leaving Annie's Land. That is not an argument for leaving any of the communities that are served, because I agree. I think Jackie Bailey, Paul McNeill in particular, made this point. I think it's a very peculiar way forward to predicate your decision about what communities should be supported by the mere fact that lease arrangements for particular offices are coming to an end. I agree. Of course.
Ross Greer.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for giving way. I thought he might benefit from hearing, given that Dean Lockhart has brought up the House of Commons Scottish Affairs Committee having this debate at the same time as ourselves, that a Conservative member of that committee has just said that the evidence that they've heard is compelling against the proposals from the DWP and that they should start again with this process.
Jamie Hepburn.
I can only hope that that is a salient message that Conservative members will hear one of their colleagues raising south of the border. And let me say, I can only hope that UK Government ministers have been as assiduously watching the progress of this debate here in the Scottish Parliament as Mr Lockhart was watching the progress of that evidence session at the UK Parliament Select Committee. But I was going to make the point, I agree with Gordon Lyndhurst. I didn't agree with much of what he had to say, but I do agree people matter, not buildings. It isn't the specific buildings, the specific bricks and mortar that concern us in this instance. It is the specific proposals to withdraw from communities. Mr Tompkins and Mr Bowman made much about the unanimous view of the Select Committee on Working Pensions that Jobcentre Plus has to reform. Again, I don't think anyone would dispute that any public institution should be subject to reform and revision and change. But what we're debating here isn't the process of reform. What we're debating here are a specific set of specific closures, proposals which, as we've just heard very clearly, at least one Conservative member of the Scottish Affairs Select Committee concedes is without any evidence base. Tory members here neither condone nor condemn these proposals? Well, the Tories are clearly looking to cull and close these specific job centres. Aaron Tompkins urged me to demonstrate more maturity in my approach to this matter. I think that was, if he doesn't mind me saying, uncharacteristically churlish of him. I think my intervention on him must have irked him and upset him a little. But he knows, because I've made every effort to let him know, along with other members who represent the City of Glasgow, I have sought to engage with DWP Minister to seek ways we can pursue alternatives to these closures, and we will continue to pursue such. And officials from Skills Development Scotland and Department of Work and Pensions met on the 30th of January 2017. Skills Development Scotland responded to the DWP consultation. They have set out very specific proposals about how they might be able to allow for a continued service from their premises at specific locations in the City of Glasgow, and undoubtedly will be happy to continue to engage in that dialogue in other parts of the country. And I'll be very happy to consider how we can see other ways in which we can work with others. I know that the leader of Glasgow City Council, the leader of the opposition on Glasgow City Council, have set out their concern about the closures in Glasgow. Local authorities can have a role to play here. Bob Doris made very clearly the point that there are community organisations in Maryhill, where he represents third sector organisations, that could be part of the equation in supporting the continued provision of service. Ms Wells made a number of innovative suggestions about ways that we could approach outreach services, and I will happily pursue each and every suggestion that she has earnestly made. But I did think it was rather telling when I asked her what response that she and Mr Tompkins have had from the Department of Work and Pensions to their specific proposition. She couldn't confirm that she's even received a response. So it seems that the problems that we have in achieving two-way dialogue aren't restricted just between the two administrations, but it actually even happens within the Conservative Party itself. Mr Tompkins and other Conservative members have urged me to provide real proposals about co-location. I'll readily commit to doing that. We're already starting, as I've set out, to work towards that. I'll readily hear, as I've just committed to hearing any suggestions from any member about how services can be better aligned. I'll readily take actual real proposals to the UK Government, and I'll readily make our proposals publicly available for members of this Parliament and the public to know. I'll readily commit to the proposition set out in the Conservative amendment to make our proposals plain. But let me make it very clear. I think it is a little rich to hear
excuse me, Minister. Could members coming into the chamber please do so quietly and refrain from private conversations, please?
Well, all I can say, President Officer, is they weren't putting me off. So to continue with the point I was making, I think it is a little rich to hear Tory criticism of our inability thus far to provide real proposals when we have had no consultation from the DWP, no prior notification from the DWP about their specific closures. It is rather difficult to provide specific proposals for specific locations when we find out about them when they are publicly announced. And there was a clear example of the poor process of consultation and communication when my friend George Adam, who is the, as we all know, the assiduous and ardent representative of his hometown of Paisley, where he was able to let us know that as that town's representative, he has had no communication from the UK Government about the closure that will take place in his town. That is completely unacceptable, and I can assure Mr Adam I will raise that very matter with Damien Hines and Damien Green. So perhaps Tory members want to reflect on the process that's been engaged in by their party in government south of the border. It is a real telling example that we have some way to go to make paragraph 58 of the Smith Commission agreement real and meaningful. And let me say that the arguments I deploy around making that meaningful aren't some obscure constitutional argument just for its own sake, lest anyone make that suggestion. I think the process we have seen here would set out why, if it was in place, it would be a very practical way how we could explore how better to support people into employment. Many members spoke of their own local issues. Bob Doris, of course, had his members' debate in Maryhill. Claire Hawkey spoke about her own constituency. Jackie Bailey and Ross Greer spoke of the circumstances at Alexandria, like Mr Doris. It's an area I know very well. My father's family were from that part of the world, and I understand the difficulties in travel that will be reflected in other areas, of course, but in that particular area, I very much understand the difficulty in travel between Alexandria to Dumbarton and in the opposite direction as well. Jackie Bailey set out that the UK government, I think if I heard her correctly, I'm sure she'll correct me if I'm wrong, I think she suggested that the UK government had invited her to discuss the situation in Alexandria in London. Well, I have to say, I think the UK government would do rather better to listen to the invites that Ms Bailey and Mr Greer have given to them to visit the site in Alexandria and to see what the reality is on the ground. Although, given their confusion between Musselburgh and Glasgow, I suggest they'll probably need to look for Alexandria on a map first of all. But what I will say, presiding officer, is that I will readily commit to visiting any community affected, meeting with any local organisation and service users who are affected by these changes if any member wants to invite me to. I might even walk through the fields with Mr Greer and Ms Bailey if they invite me to do so. I know coming to a close, President Officer, but Gordon Lyndhurst talked about the increased utilisation of online services. That is all well and good, but in May 2016, he was talking about what was in place in 1998. Well, let me talk about what happened in May 2016. Citizens Advice Bureau Scotland undertook research that shows 1 in 5 clients of the Jobcentre Plus cannot use a computer, 21% never use the internet, 59% can't claim benefits online without help, and 54% can't apply for a job online without help. So it is rather rich to say that because of the changed nature of the world, we can just move towards online applications. That does not reflect the reality on the ground. President Officer, I haven't even talked about the reality that this will increase sanctions. But let me conclude by saying I do hope that the UK government has been listening today. I'm not particularly interested in getting the Tories here to condemn or condone these closures. What I am interested in is getting this Parliament's voice heard by the UK government. I want all parties here to be part of that process. The Tories in recent weeks have said often that members should stand up and be counted for their constituents. Well, Annie Wells and Adam Tompkins have raised their concerns about this process in Glasgow. Ruth Davidson, the leader of the Conservatives in this place, has a potential Jobcentre closure in her constituency. So let them and their colleagues stand up for their constituents this evening. Let's back the motion. Let's get the UK government to halt this process, and let's ensure continued service for people who need it to get into employment.
Thank you. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 3901 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press their request to speak button now. I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion 3901.
Formally moved.
Thank you. And no one's asked to speak against the motion. I put the question to the Chamber. The question is that we agree motion 3901 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item of business is consideration of 4 Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move en bloc motion 3902 on approval of an SSI, motion 3904 on suspension and variation of standing orders, and motions 3903 and 3906 on designation of lead committees.
Moved en bloc.
Thank you. So there are 3 questions to be put today. The first is that Amendment 3873.1 in the name of Adam Tompkins, which seeks to amend Motion 3873 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on the future of Jobcentre Plus network in Scotland, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote, and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on Amendment 3873.1 in the name of Adam Tompkins is yes 30, no 91. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that Motion 3873 in the name of Jamie Hepburn be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. The
Parliament will move to a vote and we'll cast the votes now. The result of the vote on motion 3873 in the name of Jamie Hepburn is yes 91, no 30. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. I propose to ask a single question on Parliamentary Bureau motions 3902, 3904, 3903 and 3906. If any member objects, please say so now. No members objected. Therefore, the question is that we agree the above mentioned 4 motions in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. That concludes decision time. We'll now move to members' business in the name of Bill Kidd. And we'll just take a few moments to change seats.